On November 3rd, 1974, following the armed robbery of the Royal Bank of Scotland in Ipswich, 5 perpetrators fled the scene in a stolen transit van, later abandoning the vehicle at the Harwich docks. The suspects were identified as Frank the Brick Mason, age 42, George Hennington, age 35, Salvatore Twitch Vargo, age 26, Leonard Pop Fleming, age 51, and Arthur Miller, age 29. They commandeered a fishing trawler, the North Star, and headed into the North Sea during a Force 9 gale. 3 days later, a coastal patrol recovered Arthur Miller, floating on debris 10 miles off the coast of Sealand. He was hypothermic, incoherent, and missing 2 fingers on his left hand. The following is the transcribed statement of Arthur Miller, recorded November 7th, 1974, regarding the fate of the other 4 men. Scotland Yard has classified the details of the location as inconsistent with reality. This is the story as I remember it, but you will not believe me. Nobody believes me. We had been on that water for 6 hours, maybe 7. Time stops existing when the horizon is just a gray line where the freezing sky meets the freezing ocean. We were not sailors. We were pavement pounders from East London. Frank Mason, we called him the Brick because that is about how much imagination he had, was screaming at the wind, trying to steer a rusted bucket of bolts through waves that looked like moving mountains. I was huddled in the stern, trying to keep the bile down. Every time the boat dipped, my stomach hit my throat. It was cold. Not just chilly. I mean the kind of wet, invasive cold that gets into your marrow and stays there. The spray coming off the North Sea felt like buckshot against your skin. We were soaked through our coats within the first 20 minutes. Sal Vargo was crying. He was a kid, 26, but acted 12. He was curled up on a pile of wet nets, clutching the canvas bag with the money like it was a life preserver. He kept saying we were going to die out there, that the coppers did not need to catch us because the water was going to do the job. I did not answer him. I was too busy watching the fuel gauge. We were burning diesel fast, fighting the current. We needed a place to lay low, wait out the heat, wait out the storm. But out here, there is nothing but gray waste. That is when George saw them. He was up near the bow, holding onto the railing with hands the size of shovels. He yelled that there were structures dead ahead. I pulled myself up, fighting the sway of the deck, and looked out into the mist. At first, I thought they were ships. Massive, stationary ships on stilts. But as we got closer, the shapes sharpened. They were towers. 7 of them. Great, hulking metal boxes sitting on concrete legs, rising 50 feet out of the churning water. They looked like the skeletons of giant machines that had waded out into the ocean and died there. The Maunsell Forts. I had heard of them. Leftovers from the war. Anti-aircraft towers abandoned by the Army and Navy back in the 50s. They stood in a cluster, connected by rusted catwalks that swung in the wind. No lights, no movement. Just rust and silence. Frank yelled from the wheelhouse, his eyes wide and manic, saying that was the hideout. He said no copper is going to come out here in this weather and that we dock there. I looked at those towers. They did not look like safety. They looked like tombstones. Dark, jagged and rotting. The metal was flaking off in sheets, and the windows were just black holes staring down at us. I got a feeling then, a cold prickle on the back of my neck, that had nothing to do with the wind. I wanted to tell Frank to keep driving, to take our chances with the fuel. But you did not argue with Frank when he had that look in his eye. We turned the boat toward the legs of the central tower. The sound of the waves slamming against those concrete pillars was like artillery fire. It was the sound of something heavy breaking against something hard. We were walking right into a trap, but we were too cold and too greedy to see it. Getting close to the towers was harder than spotting them. The North Sea does not like visitors. The water around those concrete legs was churning like a washing machine, creating these violent, sucking eddies. Frank was fighting the wheel, screaming curses that were getting torn away by the wind before they even left his mouth. We maneuvered the North Star alongside one of the rusted pylons. There was a maintenance ladder bolted into the concrete, leading up to a catwalk about 40 feet above us. But ladder is a generous word. It was a skeleton of corroded iron, half-eaten by 30 years of salt spray. The bottom rungs were missing entirely, sheared off by the waves. Frank barked at George to get the rope. The boat was heaving up and down, a swing of 10 feet easily. One second the ladder was right there, the next it was 20 feet above your head. You had to time the jump perfectly. If you missed, you went into the drink. And in that water, with those currents, you would be sucked onto the concrete and crushed before you could even hold your breath. George went first. He was a big man, George, mostly muscle and bad decisions. He waited for the trawler to crest a wave, then he launched himself. He hit the rusty rungs with a clang that vibrated through the hull. I watched his hands, white-knuckled, gripping iron that was slick with algae and oil. He scrambled up a few feet, finding purchase, and threw the rope down for the rest of us. I went next. I remember the smell of the concrete. Wet, ancient, and smelling of dead fish. When I grabbed the ladder, the cold burned my palms. The rust flaked off instantly, coating my hands in this gritty red paste. It felt like I was holding on to dried blood. I hauled myself up, my boots slipping on the slime. The wind up there was ferocious. It felt like it was trying to peel me off the side of the tower. Sal was terrified. He froze halfway up, screaming he could not look down. I had to grab his belt and physically haul him up the last few rungs. Pop Fleming was last. He was 51, with a smoker's lung and bad knees. I watched him struggle, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. Every breath he took sounded like a majestic bellows wheezing. We almost lost him twice. Once when his foot slipped, and once when a rung actually snapped in his hand, crumbling into dust. When we finally hit the catwalk, we collapsed. We were shivering, soaked, and exhausted. But we were not safe yet. We were just higher up in the cold. The catwalk was a grid of steel mesh. You could look right through it and see the angry black water 40 feet down. Walking on it felt wrong. It groaned under our weight, like the metal was complaining about being alive. We moved single file towards the main door of the central tower. It was a heavy, watertight bulkhead built to stop shrapnel and storms, and it was rusted shut, welded by time. Frank kicked it, yelling for it to open. Nothing. Just a dull thud. I told him it was seized and to look at the hinges, which were one solid block of rust. Frank did not care. He told George to get the crowbar from the kit because we were not staying out there to freeze. This is where the work started. Real work, not movie work. We spent 20 minutes just chipping away the crust around the seal. George hammered the pry bar into the gap, the sound of metal on metal screeching out over the ocean like a dying animal. My job was to hold the flashlight. My hands were shaking so bad the beam was dancing all over the door. We took turns on the bar. Heave, crunch, heave, crunch. You could feel the metal protesting. It was not yielding, it was tearing. My shoulders burned, my fingers were numb stumps. Sal was useless, just huddled in the corner guarding the money, shivering. Finally, with a sound like a gunshot, the The seal broke. The rust gave way. A blast of stale, pressurized air hit us in the face. It did not smell like the ocean. It smelled like dead air, like dust and old diesel and time. It was the smell of a tomb that had not been opened since the king died. George leaned his shoulder into it, and the heavy iron door shrieked inward. It was pitch black inside. Absolute, suffocating darkness. The wind noise cut out instantly, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like pressure in your ears. Frank stepped in first, his flashlight cutting a yellow cone through the dust motes. He said we were in, and told George to secure the door behind us so the wind would not blow it open. We stepped out of the roar of the North Sea and into the belly of the beast. And the first thing I noticed was that it was not empty. There were cigarette butts on the floor. Not from the war. Recent ones. The inside of the fort was a maze of corrugated iron and rivets. It was colder inside than out, if that is possible. A damp, still cold that settled in your lungs. The flashlight beams cut through the gloom, revealing peeling lead paint hanging off the walls like dead skin. Every footstep on the metal grating rang out like a bell strike, echoing up and down the shafts. You could not sneak in a place like this. We moved past rooms that looked like they had been abandoned in a hurry. A mess hall, with tin plates still rusted to the table. A bunk room with mattresses that had turned into black mold. The smell was overpowering. Diesel fumes, rust, and something else. Something muskier, like wet dog fur drying near a heater. Frank led us up a spiral staircase in the center of the tower to the top-level command center. We spiraled up 3 flights. The air got thinner, hazier with tobacco smoke. That is when I knew for sure we were not alone. The smoke was fresh, acrid, unfiltered stuff. At the top of the stairs, there was a heavy blast door standing slightly ajar. A faint yellow glow spilled out from the crack. Lantern light. We froze. Frank pulled the Webley revolver from his coat pocket. He looked at me, nodded, and then kicked the door wide open. We rushed in, adrenaline spiking, expecting to find a patrol, or squatters, or maybe just another gang. But it was just him. The room was a circular observation deck. Windows ran all the way around, offering a panoramic view of the storm raging outside. In the center of the room sat a solitary figure in a high-backed wooden chair, facing the sea. He did not jump. He did not turn around. He did not even stiffen. He was an old man, had to be pushing 70, maybe older. He wore a thick wool maritime coat that looked like it was from the last century, and his hair was long, silver, and matted down his back. He was smoking a pipe, slowly, rhythmically. Frank aimed the gun at the back of the man's head and ordered him to turn around, slowly. The man took a long drag from his pipe, let the smoke curl up towards the rusted ceiling fan, and then, very slowly, swiveled the chair. His face looked like it had been carved out of driftwood, weather-beaten, lined with deep fissures, and eyes that were a milky, pale blue. They locked onto Frank, then me, then Sal. He did not look scared. He looked disappointed. He told us we were letting the heat out. His voice was like grinding stones. A thick, guttural accent. Maybe Dutch? Maybe Old English? I could not place it. Frank stepped closer, the gun shaking slightly in his grip. He asked who he was and if he had a radio. The old man laughed. It was not a happy sound. It was a dry, rasping wheeze. He asked who we would call. The ghosts? He said there had not been a radio in this tower since '56. He looked at our clothes, our soaked suits, the bag of money Sal was clutching. He told us we were a long way from home and had chosen a bad night to come visiting. I stepped forward. I told him we just needed shelter because the weather was too rough. I said we had food and would not bother him. The old man's eyes bored into me. He repeated the word, shelter, tasting it. He said there was no shelter here, not for us. He said the iron kept the sea out, but it kept other things in. Frank lost his patience. He cracked the old man across the face with the barrel of the Webley. Smack! A line of blood trickled down the old man's cheek. He did not even flinch. He just licked the blood away, his eyes never leaving Frank's. Frank yelled, asking who else was here and where he was hiding his supplies. The old man smiled, revealing teeth that were yellow and filed sharp. He said he was the keeper. He said he had been there since the guns went silent. He said he watched the tides and fed the dark. Sal whimpered from the doorway, saying he was crazy and we should just tie him up. The keeper looked at Sal and asked if it was crazy to run into the North Sea in a Force 9 gale. Was it crazy to climb a condemned tower in the dark? He said no. That was not madness. That was desperation. He said he could smell it on us. He said we smelled like fear and sweat and greed. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper that cut through the noise of the wind outside, and he said that he could smell it too. A chill went through me that had nothing to do with the wet clothes. I asked who could smell us. The keeper pointed a gnarled finger toward the floor, indicating the levels below us, the deep dark of the lower pontoons. He said the one who sleeps in the iron. He said he wakes up when the sun goes down. And gentlemen, the sun is almost gone. I looked out the window. He was right. The gray light was fading fast into a bruised purple. Night was coming, and we were 40 miles from land, trapped in a tin can with a lunatic. Frank grabbed some baling wire from a shelf. He told us to shut up and tie him to the chair. He told George to check the perimeter and Pop to find water. He told me to watch the old bastard and shoot him if he moved. We tied him up. He did not fight. He just let us wrap the wire around his wrists, his eyes following our every move. He looked at us like we were already dead. Like we were walking corpses that just had not figured it out yet. I sat on a crate opposite him, the gun in my lap. The other boys dispersed to search the level. It was just me and him. The wind howled against the glass, rattling the frames. The keeper told me I should jump into the sea. He said it would be quicker. The water is cold, yes. You will go numb in minutes. You will sleep. It is a mercy compared to what happens when the lights go out. I told him to shut his mouth, trying to sound tough like Frank, but my voice cracked. The keeper noted I was missing fingers and asked if it was a work accident or a debt unpaid. I told him it was none of his business. He mused about pain. He said I thought I knew pain, but I did not. But I would learn. Before the morning comes, we would all learn. That is when the lights flickered. The single bulb hanging from the ceiling buzzed, dimmed, and then surged back to life. But in that brief second of darkness, I swore I heard something. Not the wind, not the sea. It was a sound coming from the spiral staircase. A low, wet snarl, like a large dog clearing its throat. I looked at the keeper. He was smiling again. He whispered that it was dinner time. The growl had barely faded when the tower shook. I do not mean a little vibration. I mean the whole structure lurched like it had been punched by a giant fist. It sounded like a car crash, magnified by 10. Metal shrieking against concrete, glass shattering. The sound came from below, from the waterline. George yelled that it was the bloody boat. We scrambled down the spiral stairs, leaving the old man tied to the chair. We moved fast, sliding down the railings, boots clanging on the iron steps. The sound of the wind got louder as we descended, roaring through the cracks in the plating. When we reached the bottom level, the heavy iron door was groaning. Frank shoved past me and through the latch. He kicked the door open and the storm punched us in the face. Rain, horizontal and freezing, lashed into the room. We rushed out onto the catwalk, or what was left of it. I looked down into the black churn of the sea. The North Star was gone. Well, not gone, it was dissolved. The storm had picked up the trawler and smashed it repeatedly against the concrete pylon. It was just splinters and fiberglass now, bobbing in the foam. A fuel slick was spreading out on top of the waves, shimmering like a rainbow in the dark. Sal fell to his knees on the grating, staring down at the wreckage. He was crying about his money, saying he left the bag on the bunk. He was not worried about the boat. He was worried about the loot. Frank grabbed Sal by the collar and hauled him up. He told him to forget the money because we were stuck. He said there was no swimming to Ipswich in this. I looked out at the other towers. They were just dark shapes in the rain. No lights. No bridges connecting them anymore. Those had fallen into the sea years ago. We were on an island of rust, 40 feet above a freezing death, with no way off. We retreated back inside and slammed the heavy door, spinning the wheel to lock it. The silence returned, but now it felt different. It felt heavy, final. We trudged back up the stairs, slower this time. The adrenaline was turning into a cold, sick dread. When we got back to the command center, the old man had not moved. He was still smoking that pipe, staring at his reflection in the dark glass. He said he told us the sea takes what is hers. Frank walked over and put the gun to the old man's temple. He accused him of doing this, asking if he had some way to control the tides. The old man chuckled. He said he controlled nothing. He was just the witness. The boat was gone. Now the cage was locked. He turned his head slowly to look at Frank and said that now the feeding begins. Frank screamed at him to stop talking in riddles. The old man calmly explained that the generator was in the basement and the fuel line was clogged. It cuts out when the temperature drops. And it is dropping. As if on cue, the single light bulb above us buzzed. It dimmed to a dull orange glow, held it for a second, and then clicked off. Darkness. Absolute, heavy, pitch black. The kind of dark you can taste. Frank yelled for Pop to get the lighter. A spark flared, then a small flame flickered to life. Pop held his Zippo up, his hand shaking. The small flame cast long, dancing shadows against the peeling walls. It barely illuminated the room. In the flickering light, I looked at the old man's chair. It was empty. The baling wire was lying on the seat, still in loops. Not cut, not broken, just empty, like he had melted right through it. George panic whispered, asking where he was. Then we heard it. From the ceiling. From the ventilation ducts that ran through the entire fort. Scrape. 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 It was the sound of something sharp dragging across sheet metal, moving fast, moving directly above our heads. I whispered that he was in the vents. Sal whimpered that it was not a man, that a man does not move like that. Frank pointed the gun at the ceiling, yelling for it to come out. The scraping stopped, right above us. Then, a drop of liquid hit Pop's hand, right next to the lighter flame. Pop brought his hand closer to his face to see what it was. In the firelight, it was thick, dark, and viscous. It was saliva. I told them to run, and then the ceiling vent exploded downward. The metal grate above us did not just fall, it was torn open. A massive, dark shape dropped into the center of the room like an anvil. It landed on Pop Fleming before the old man could even close his lighter. The flame went out. For a split second, we were in total blackness, but the sound was horrible. It was not a scream. It was a wet, crunching noise, like a sledgehammer hitting a side of beef. Pop did not even have time to yell, just a sudden, sharp intake of breath, and then the sound of bones snapping. Frank opened fire. The muzzle flash of the Webley .38 was blinding in the dark. It worked like a strobe light. Flash. I saw Pop on the floor, pinned under something massive. Flash. I saw fur. Wet, matted, gray fur. Flash. I saw a hand. A claw. Long, hooked talons digging into Pop's chest, ripping through his coat like it was wet paper. The noise in that steel room was deafening. My ears rang like a church bell had gone off inside my head. I could not hear Frank yelling. I could only see his mouth moving, his face twisted in terror and rage. He was firing blindly at the shape, but the thing was fast. It moved with this unnatural, jerking speed, scrambling off Pop and up the wall, literally running on the vertical rivets to avoid the shots. George grabbed my collar and yanked me backward. We scrambled out of the command center, tripping over each other in the dark. I smashed my shoulder against the door frame, a jolt of pain that barely registered over the panic. We basically fell down the first flight of the spiral staircase, sliding on the metal steps. It was chaos. We hit the landing of the level below, the bunk level. Frank was the last one down. He slammed the bulkhead door at the top of the stairs and spun the locking wheel. We could hear him hyperventilating in the dark. He gasped for light. George fumbled in his pocket and cracked a flare. A red, chemical hiss filled the corridor, bathing us in this bloody crimson glow. The shadows danced violently against the peeling paint. I looked around. Me, George, Frank, Sal. Sal asked where Pop was. We all knew the answer. We looked up at the ceiling, the floor of the room above us. We could hear it walking around up there, heavy footsteps. And then, a sound that made my blood turn to ice water. It was a tearing sound, wet and rhythmic. It was eating him, right above our heads. Frank leaned against the wall, sliding down until he hit the floor. He whispered that he knew he hit it. He saw blood spray, but it did not even slow down. I looked at Frank's coat. There was a spray of dark liquid across his chest. I told him that was not the monster's blood. That was Pop's. Sal threw up. He just leaned over and vomited onto the grating. George asked what it was, saying it wasn't the old man, but a bloody animal. I told him it had hands. I saw them. It had fingers, long ones, but the claws were 6 inches long. We sat there in the red dark for a minute, listening to the feasting upstairs. Then the sound stopped. The heavy footsteps moved across the ceiling, towards the center of the room, towards the spiral staircase shaft. Then, silence. I realized he was coming down. The vents, the stairs. He knew where we were. Frank reloaded the Webley. His hands were shaking so bad he dropped 2 bullets through the floor grate. They fell into the abyss below. Frank said we needed to keep moving. Down. To the generator room. If we could get the lights on, maybe we could find a weapon. Or a radio. I laughed a hysterical, broken laugh. I reminded Frank the old man said there had not been a radio here since the 50s. We were on our own. Frank barked at us to move, pointing the gun down the stairs. As we turned to go, I looked back up the stairwell. The red light of the flare did not reach the top, But just at the edge of the darkness, I saw 2 points of light. Milky blue eyes, reflecting the flare, watching us. They blinked, and then they vanished. We moved down into the bowels of the tower. Level 4, the industrial deck. If the upstairs was a tomb, this was the intestine. It was a labyrinth of steam pipes, water tanks, and narrow catwalks that zigzagged over open drops to the bilge water far below. The flare was dying, sputtering sparks that hissed when they hit the wet floor. We were walking in a strobe light of dying red and absolute black. The sound of the ocean was deafening down here. The waves were smashing against the hollow steel legs right next to us, creating a booming resonance that vibrated your teeth. It masked everything. You could not hear footsteps. You could not hear breathing. You could only hear the tower screaming. Frank took point, gun raised. I was in the middle. George and Sal were guarding the rear. We had to move single file. The walkway was barely 2 feet wide, bordered by a rusted railing that would not stop a toddler, let alone a grown man. Frank yelled to keep moving, that the generator room was past the turbine hall. Sal was lagging. He was still clutching that damn canvas bag. It was soaked with seawater and heavy. He yelled for us to wait, saying his bootlace was caught on the grate. I turned around. Sal was bent over, trying to untangle his foot from a gap in the mesh flooring. George told him to leave the boot and move. That is when I saw it. Not above us, below us. Under the mesh walkway. Hanging upside down from the pipes like a bat. It was right underneath Sal's feet. I screamed for Sal to look out, but the ocean roar swallowed my voice. A hand, gray, matted and tipped with those black scythes, shot up through the gap in the grating. It grabbed Sal's ankle. There was a sickening snap as it yanked him downwards. Sal did not just fall, he was pulled. His leg went through the grate, shattering the bone against the steel mesh. He screamed, but the sound was drowned out by the storm. The creature pulled harder. It was trying to drag him through a hole barely 6 inches wide. It was impossible physics. Sal was thrashing, clawing at the grating, his fingernails scraping sparks off the metal. He yelled for George to help him. George did not run. I will give him that. He swung that crowbar with both hands, aiming for the fingers coming through the floor. He hit the metal mesh, missing the beast. The creature let out a hiss, not a roar, a hiss, and released Sal's leg. For a second, I thought we had won. Sal slumped back, sobbing, his leg bent at a right angle. Then the walkway lurched. The creature had not fled. It had just moved to the support strut. With a screech of tearing metal, the entire section of the catwalk George and Sal were standing on detached from the wall. It swung down like a trap door. Sal went silently. He does not leave leftovers. That is the story, detective. That is where your bank robbers are. They are part of the fort now. They are fuel for the generator. You can lock me up. You can throw me in the deepest cell in Wandsworth. I do not care. At least in prison, there are bars on the windows. At least in prison, the lights stay on. But do me a favor. If you ever look out at the sea, and you see those towers standing there in the fog, don't look too long, because he is still there, sitting in the dark, waiting for the tide to bring him something new to play with. He pointed his flashlight beam at the chain George was holding, higher up in the shadows of the rafters. The creature was perched there. It was holding the chain. It was reeling George in. I saw its face clearly for the first time. It was not just a wolf. It was the old man's face, stretched over a wolf's skull. The skin was split and bleeding, the eyes wide and intelligent. It grinned at us. It looked at George, then looked at me, and then it let go of the chain. George fell. He hit a crossbeam 10 feet down with a sound like a wet sandbag, bounced, and tumbled into the blackness below. We did not hear a splash, just the clang of his body hitting pipes on the way down. It was just me and Frank now. Frank did not hesitate. He turned and ran. He sprinted toward the generator room, abandoning me in the dark. I chased him. The fear wasn't a thought anymore. It was an engine driving my legs. We burst into the generator room, a cavernous space filled with silent, rusted machinery. Frank was frantically trying to barricade the door, jamming a piece of pipe into the wheel handle. He wheezed that we were safe there. One way in, one way out. We could bottleneck it. The room was silent. The storm noise was muffled here by the thick concrete walls. We stood there for a minute, aiming the gun and the flashlight at the door, waiting for the banging to start. But the door did not move. Instead, we heard a sound from the corner of the room, a slow, rhythmic creaking. I slowly moved my flashlight beam across the room, past the silent diesel engines, past the fuel tanks, to the far corner. There was a rocking chair there, an old wooden rocking chair, and sitting in it was the old man. Not the wolf, the man. He was wearing his coat. He was smoking his pipe. He did not have a scratch on him. No blood, no fur. He told us we ran very fast, but we were running in circles. Frank's brain broke. I watched it happen. He could not process it. We had just seen this thing, this man, tear George apart as a monster, and now he was sitting here, dry and calm. Frank screamed, asking what he was. The old man stood up. As he stood, his shadow on the wall did not match his body. The shadow grew. It sprouted ears. It elongated. The shadow was the wolf. The old man whispered that he was the hunger. Frank fired. The bullet hit the old man in the chest. He staggered back and laughed. He opened his mouth and unhinged his jaw. It kept opening, wider than a human mouth should go. Bones cracked and reshaped under his skin. Frank tried to fire again. Click. The Webley jammed. I did not wait to see the rest. I saw Frank get lifted off his feet by a hand that exploded out of the old man's sleeve. A hand that was all fur and claws. I turned and spotted a maintenance hatch in the floor, a bilge chute. I dove for it. Behind me, I heard Frank start to scream, and then I heard the wet, tearing sound again. I threw myself into the chute and slid down into the darkness, sliding on 30 years of grease and grime, falling toward the ocean. The chute was tight. It smelled of 30 years of rot. I slid down that metal throat for what felt like forever, picking up speed, bouncing off the rivets in the dark. I was screaming, but the sound was stuck in my chest. Then, impact. I hit the water like it was concrete. The cold shock was instant. It paralyzed me. It punched the air out of my lungs and replaced it with freezing salt water. I went deep, tumbling in the black current under the tower. I did not know which way was up. I was just thrashing in the void. My hand brushed against something underwater. Something soft. A piece of the North Star? Or maybe Sal. I kicked away from it, lungs burning, and clawed my way to the surface. I broke the water, gasping, choking on foam. The storm was still raging, but down here, amongst the pylons, the waves were breaking against the concrete legs, creating a chaotic, churning washing machine of debris. I grabbed onto a piece of the trawler's hull, a jagged chunk of wood with the nameplate still painted on it. I clung to it like a limpet. My body was shutting down. The hypothermia was setting in fast. I could not feel my legs. I could not feel my hands. I looked up, way up. The tower loomed over me, a black silhouette against the storm clouds. And there, in the window of the command center, I saw the light come back on, the yellow, warm glow of a lantern. And I saw him, the old man. He was standing at the glass, looking down at me. He was not a wolf. He was just a man in a coat. He raised his hand, held it there for a second, and then he waved, a slow, mocking goodbye. Then the current took me. It dragged me out into the open sea, away from the forts. I drifted for 3 days. I do not remember much of it. Just the grey sky, the freezing nights, and the sound of Frank's scream playing on a loop in my head. When the coastal patrol fished me out, they said I was delirious. They said I kept talking about the keeper and the hunger. They told me they searched the forts. They sent a helicopter out there. They found nothing. No bodies, no blood, no rocking chair. Just rust and bird crap. They said the towers had been sealed shut for 20 years. They said it was impossible for us to have been inside. But I know what I saw. And I know why they did not find Frank, or George, or Pop, or Sal. He does not leave leftovers. That is the story, detective. That is where your bank robbers are. They are part of the fort now. They are fuel for the generator. You can lock me up. You can throw me in the deepest cell in Wandsworth. I do not care. At least in prison, there are bars on the windows. At least in prison, the lights stay on. But do me a favor. If you ever look out at the sea, and you see those towers standing there in the fog, don't look too long, because he is still there, sitting in the dark, waiting for the tide to bring him something new to play with.